Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, catching on the glassware my wife, Molly, had meticulously arranged on the counter. Our kitchen, like everything in our life, was orderly and polished, outwardly flawless. We had a beautiful home, the kind of place people look at and say, "Now, that's a successful couple." But inside, things were far from perfect, and I was starting to realize just how much I had been ignoring. Molly had always been captivating, with a lively charm and a smile that could make strangers feel like they'd known her forever. She was a chartered accountant with a schedule full of travel and networking events. I hadn't thought much of it initially. Her job came with those perks, and we both had our own lives outside our marriage. But her trips had been growing more frequent, her stories of co-workers like her new colleague, Nick, more animated. And for the first time, I had begun to notice how much she had started drifting, leaving me in a sea of suspicions I didn't want to acknowledge. It was late October, a crisp morning on the weekend, when I walked into the garage to grab a toolbox for some minor home repairs. Molly was out on another business trip, so I figured I'd keep myself busy. I spotted an old, dusty suitcase tucked away in the corner, one I didn't recognize. I opened it, expecting some random old items we'd forgotten about. Instead, inside were souvenirs, postcards, trinkets, even receipts, from places Molly had never mentioned. Places she'd never told me she'd been. I knew she had traveled for work, but not to these locations. My pulse quickened as I sifted through the evidence, each item feeling like a new betrayal. There were restaurant bills from fancy places in cities she'd supposedly never visited, hotel room keys, and even a small bottle of expensive perfume I'd never seen her wear at home. I'd always thought that our marriage was unshakable. We had a life people envied, 2 beautiful children, a close-knit group of friends. But here I was, clutching a handful of receipts and cheap souvenirs that screamed betrayal. I stuffed the evidence back into the suitcase and sat there, taking deep, deliberate breaths. My mind was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I needed proof, something solid to confront her with and leave her no room for escape. That evening, I sat alone at the dinner table, my mind replaying every odd moment in recent months. Every time she'd said she was working late, every time she seemed to be miles away even when she was sitting right beside me. The pieces were falling into place, and it was almost too painful to accept. But I had to know for certain. So, I did something I never thought I would, I checked our phone bill. It was late by the time I finally pulled up the records, but the rush of adrenaline kept me wide awake. I combed through the list of numbers, noting one that kept reappearing, often late at night. It had a Virginia area code, which made no sense. Neither of us had any reason to contact anyone in Virginia. I felt sick, but I pushed myself to keep going. I ran the number through an online search, which confirmed my worst fear. It was a VoIP number, one that people use to stay anonymous. The only reason someone would use such a number was to keep something hidden. When Molly came back from her trip the next day, I kept my composure, storing away every emotion that threatened to crack the surface. She breezed in with her usual bright smile and the charm that had won me over all those years ago. She hugged our kids and asked about their weekend. I watched her closely, every smile, every laugh, wondering how many of them were genuine and how many were lies. I told myself I'd wait for the right moment, not wanting to fly off the handle without having every bit of evidence I could gather. Then, as if fate were giving me one last nudge, we were invited to a party that weekend. It was one of those gatherings where everyone knew everyone else's business, full of familiar faces and familiar conversations. Molly seemed a little tense, though, and I couldn't help but notice the way she kept checking her phone, the quick glances she cast around the room. And then, like a scene from a twisted drama, her colleague, Nick, the one she'd spoken about too often, approached our table. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes before she turned to introduce him to me, forcing a smile. I shook his hand, trying to hide the anger simmering inside me. Watching them interact felt surreal, almost like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Molly seemed flustered, her laughter too high-pitched, her gaze a little too eager. And Nick, well, he was charming, confident, and oblivious to the tension radiating from me. They spoke about work and mutual acquaintances, and I listened carefully, piecing together the small, unspoken details between them. When Nick finally excused himself to mingle, I pulled Molly aside. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just work, you know that." "Work," I repeated, struggling to keep my anger in check. "You mean the business trips, the late nights? All with Nick?" Her face turned a shade paler, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just work." For a brief moment, I wanted to believe her, to push aside the growing mountain of evidence and the gut-wrenching truth that lay beneath it. But then she said something that solidified my resolve. "I don't know why you're being so paranoid, but it's not a good look on you." I let the comment slide, bottling my anger for later. But in that moment, I decided I'd let her dig her own grave. The days after that party were a blur. I went through the motions of my daily life, but my mind was elsewhere, wrapped up in the betrayal that was slowly tearing me apart. I kept replaying the events, every moment when Molly and Nick had exchanged those unguarded looks, the way she'd laughed a little too much at his jokes. In some corner of my mind, I hoped it was all a mistake, but the evidence was overwhelming, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. So I waited, gathering my strength and patience. I knew that confronting Molly impulsively would give her the upper hand, a chance to twist her lies or deny everything. Instead, I bided my time, watching her every move with newfound clarity. Every night she claimed to be working late, every text she answered with a quick, secretive smile. I made a mental note. I was building a case, one detail at a time. One evening, I had my first breakthrough. I decided to check her email, a boundary I never thought I'd cross. She was out again, this time meeting a friend from work for drinks, so I knew I had time. Her laptop was in her office, and for the first time, I noticed she'd left it unlocked. I hesitated, my hands hovering over the keyboard. But the thought of Nick's smirk, of Molly's barely concealed affection for him, gave me the resolve I needed. The inbox was a goldmine. Emails from Nick, labeled innocuously as work update or follow-up, dotted the page. The messages started out professional enough, but as I read on, I noticed the subtle shift in tone. Inside jokes, personal anecdotes, even a few photos from what looked like a company trip but included just the two of them, too cozy to pass as mere colleagues. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the messages, feeling both enraged and betrayed. The final email in the chain was what broke me. A simple message from Nick, sent late at night: "Can't wait to see you again, Moll. Last weekend was amazing." I didn't need more details. The implication was clear. I closed her laptop and sat in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. My mind raced, torn between confronting her and walking away from everything we'd built. But I knew one thing: I couldn't let her get away with this. I couldn't let her walk all over me and our family, pretending that everything was fine while she lived a double life. And so, my plan for revenge began to take shape. The next day, I did something I never thought I'd do: I hired a private investigator. I wanted to be absolutely certain, to know every last detail of her betrayal before I confronted her. The PI, a middle-aged man named Frank, listened carefully to my story, his expression both sympathetic and businesslike. "It's a common story," he said quietly, handing me his card. "You're not the first, and unfortunately, you won't be the last. I'll start right away. I'll be in touch when I have something concrete." Leaving Frank's office, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming control, and for the first time in weeks, I felt that I wasn't helpless. I could already imagine the look on Molly's face when I confronted her with every piece of evidence, every lie she told exposed. Days turned into weeks as I waited for updates from Frank. Every time Molly went on a supposed business trip or had a late night at the office, I stayed calm, knowing that Frank was tracking her every move. I kept up appearances at home, cooking dinner for the kids, making small talk with Molly as though nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, and I knew that when it finally broke, there would be no going back. One evening, I got the call from Frank. His voice was steady, but I could hear a trace of anger, as though he, too, felt the weight of Molly's betrayal. "We've got it all, sir. Photos, records, the works. She's been meeting with him regularly, at hotels, sometimes even in our own city. I've emailed you the full report and attached every piece of evidence." I thanked him, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. After hanging up, I sat down and opened the email. Frank hadn't held back. The photos showed Molly and Nick together at various locations, walking hand in hand, laughing, and even kissing. It was the proof I'd been waiting for, the proof that shattered any lingering hope I had of this being some terrible misunderstanding. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing her that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. I closed my laptop, my mind racing with the possibilities. I knew how I wanted to handle this, and it wouldn't be a quick confrontation or a furious outburst. No, I wanted Molly to feel every ounce of betrayal I had felt, to understand what it meant to be deceived by the person you trusted most. That night, as Molly came home late again, I waited for her at the kitchen table. She was surprised to see me up, her expression shifting to something unreadable. She'd clearly been drinking, her smile a little too wide, her steps unsteady. "Hey," she said, trying to sound casual. "Why are you up so late?" "I couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I was just thinking about us. About everything we've built together." Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, taking a seat across from me. "You're being so serious," she laughed, but there was a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Yeah, I suppose I am," I said, meeting her gaze. "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage. About trust, honesty, all those little things that make a relationship strong." She shifted uncomfortably, clearly taken aback by my sudden introspection. "Well, I think we're pretty solid," she said, forcing a smile. "Don't you?" "Do you?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because sometimes, it feels like you're not here. Like you're somewhere else." Molly's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing. "What are you trying to say?" "Nothing," I said, leaning back in my chair with a sigh. "Just that maybe we should be more honest with each other. After all, that's what makes a good marriage, right? Trust." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she'd crack, that she'd confess everything right then and there. But instead, she just nodded, her face a careful mask of neutrality. "Yeah, trust. Right." I knew I'd gotten to her, that my words had planted the first seeds of doubt. And as she went upstairs to bed, I stayed downstairs, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. This was just the beginning. In the days following our tense exchange at the kitchen table, I noticed Molly growing increasingly uneasy. She was quieter around the house, more guarded, her usual brightness replaced by a tension I hadn't seen before. I knew she sensed something had changed, but she didn't know the half of it. I was careful to keep up appearances, to be patient, even affectionate, while every detail of my plan continued to take shape. At the same time, I was preparing the logistics of a divorce. I met with a lawyer in secret, discussing everything from financial details to custody arrangements. The kids didn't know anything yet, and I intended to keep it that way as long as possible. In our last meeting, my lawyer had raised an eyebrow when I laid out all the evidence from the private investigator. It was clear I had more than enough to expose her infidelity in court. "Have you confronted her with any of this?" he asked, looking at the photos spread out across his desk. "Not yet," I replied, my tone icy. I want her to feel what it's like to be blindsided, to know that I had all the pieces and just waited for the right moment. The lawyer nodded thoughtfully. Understandable. But if you're ready to move forward, the sooner you do, the better. We can serve her the papers any time. I left the office with a strange sense of purpose. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was taking back control over my life, over a situation that had left me feeling powerless for far too long. And the day was finally nearing. Then, almost as if she sensed my resolve, Molly's behavior took another turn. She started going out more frequently, even during the day, claiming that her workload was particularly heavy. One night, she arrived home late and went straight to the shower without saying a word. It was a move I had come to recognize as her way of avoiding conversation, avoiding any chance I might start asking questions she didn't want to answer. That evening, as she was finishing up in the bathroom, I pulled her phone from her bag, scrolling through the messages she'd once carelessly left out in the open. She'd become more secretive since then, setting new passwords and deleting conversations, but tonight, she'd left her guard down. A single message from Nick sat on the screen: "Can't wait for this weekend. It's going to be unforgettable." I felt the familiar sting of betrayal, but this time, it didn't shake me. I felt oddly detached, as though I were watching her dig her own grave. I put the phone back just as she came into the room, toweling her hair, giving me a sidelong glance. "You're still awake?" she asked, forcing a casual tone. "Just wrapping up a few things for work," I replied. "You've been working hard too, haven't you?" She stilled for a moment, her gaze shifting to her dresser. "Yeah, it's been non-stop lately." I let her comment hang in the air, watching as she pulled on her robe and disappeared into the bathroom to avoid any further questioning. She didn't know it, but her charade was almost over. The weekend arrived, and she was in high spirits, humming as she packed her bags with an energy that felt strange. She tossed in a few of her favorite dresses, expensive perfumes, things she only saved for special occasions. I observed her quietly from the doorway, noticing how much effort she was putting into this trip, a trip she told me was just another conference. "Looks like you're packing for something special," I commented, and she froze momentarily, her expression guarded. She laughed, brushing it off. "Just want to look my best. There's a big networking event." "Of course," I said, my smile never reaching my eyes. "Enjoy yourself." I watched as she hesitated, her smile faltering before she recovered and zipped up her bag. She kissed me on the cheek, her face a carefully controlled mask. "Love you," she said, her voice ringing hollow. I didn't respond. I simply nodded, watching her leave with that suitcase full of secrets. The door closed behind her, and I was left in silence, feeling strangely calm. This was it. This was the weekend that would bring it all crashing down. The moment she was gone, I set my plan into motion. I called Frank, the private investigator, and confirmed everything. He was already in place at her hotel, ready to document her every move. I wouldn't be there, but I didn't need to be. Frank was thorough, and I trusted him to capture every moment, every incriminating detail. Later that evening, Frank sent me a message. A single photo. It was Molly and Nick, arm in arm, entering a restaurant, both of them laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. It was surreal, seeing her like that, so carefree, so deeply immersed in a life she'd hidden from me. I felt a wave of disgust and, surprisingly, a small sense of relief. The reality was there, tangible and undeniable. This was my freedom. The next day, I decided to set the final piece of my plan in motion. I spent the morning packing her things, emptying her side of the closet, filling boxes with her belongings. I placed a copy of the divorce papers on the table, the official documents that would put an end to this charade once and for all. There was no need for a dramatic confrontation, I knew that leaving her with nothing but the truth would be enough. That afternoon, I took the kids out for lunch. I hadn't told them anything yet, and it pained me to think about how this would affect them, but I wanted to shield them from the fallout as long as possible. I couldn't let Molly's selfishness ruin their lives too. When we returned, I left the house key in the divorce papers in plain view on the kitchen table, along with a note. It was short and simple. I know everything. Don't come back. By late evening, she still hadn't returned, and I received one last message from Frank, a photograph of Molly and Nick checking into a hotel room, the final piece of the puzzle. I knew she'd come back eventually, but by then, it would be too late. Everything was ready. I stayed up that night, listening to the quiet house and waiting. The boxes were stacked by the front door, her things all packed and ready for her to take. My mind was a mess of exhaustion and tension, but mostly, I felt a heavy, hollow sadness. This was the end of a life I'd thought was solid, and the realization was starting to sink in. It was just past midnight and I heard her car pull into the driveway. I stood at the window, watching as she sat there, probably checking her makeup, rehearsing whatever story she'd concocted to explain another late return. She didn't know that this time, she'd find her life upended. The front door opened softly, and she walked in, dropping her purse on the console table with her usual sigh. She didn't notice the packed boxes at first, her eyes went straight to me, standing in the dim light of the kitchen, waiting. "Why are you still up?" she asked, her voice wary. I didn't answer, just gestured toward the kitchen table where the divorce papers and the note lay waiting. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of them, and the color drained from her face. What is this?" she stammered, reaching out to touch the papers as if they'd disappear. I took a steadying breath. "It's over, Molly. I know about everything. I know about Nick, about all the work trips that were nothing but lies." I felt my voice tighten with the weight of the truth. "You've been living two lives, and I've known about it for months." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, grasping for words that didn't come. Her carefully crafted facade was crumbling, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. Defeated. I can explain," she finally whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't," I said, my voice breaking as I fought to keep my composure. "Don't insult me with excuses. I've been here, holding everything together while you ran around with him. I've seen the proof. I know all of it." Molly took a trembling step toward me, her hands reaching out, but I backed away. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking, "you have to understand. I didn't mean for this to happen. I got lost, and I didn't know how to fix things. I thought maybe if I just had this one thing." "One thing?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "This wasn't one mistake, Molly. This was a choice, every single time. You chose this, over and over again." Her shoulders sagged, and I saw the fight leave her. She slumped into a chair, her face buried in her hands, whispering apologies I didn't believe. But as I watched her, I felt my anger softening, replaced by a dull ache. We had been so close once. I'd loved her deeply. And now here we were, reduced to strangers by the walls of lies she'd built between us. "Please, just let me stay," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it. But I can't bear to lose everything, not like this." I didn't respond. I felt numb, empty, as though every ounce of love I'd ever felt for her had drained away. But I didn't want to see her beg. I didn't want to see her shattered. All I wanted was for her to leave, to take her boxes and walk out of my life so I could finally breathe again. And then, as we sat in silence, there was a sound from upstairs, a light, sleepy mumble. I looked up and realized our daughter had woken. She stood at the top of the stairs, clutching her blanket, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" "Mommy," she called softly, her voice filled with confusion and worry. My heart clenched as I saw her there, fragile and innocent, completely unaware of the storm brewing between her parents. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but Molly beat me to it. She climbed the stairs, scooping her up and cradling her, whispering gentle words to calm her. I watched them, feeling the weight of what was truly at stake, the life we'd built, the family we shared. For the first time, I questioned whether my revenge, my carefully crafted plan to make Molly feel the pain she'd caused, was worth it. Our daughter didn't deserve to be torn apart by her mother's mistakes or my bitterness. Molly came back down the stairs, our daughter asleep on her shoulder. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, as though she understood the decision I was facing. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she didn't make any more promises. She just stood there, waiting for my next move. I took a deep, shuddering breath and looked away. "You can stay," I whispered, the words barely leaving my lips. "But we'll talk tomorrow. And if you ever do this again," my voice faltered. "I'll take the kids, and you'll never see us again." Molly nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she said nothing. She took our daughter back upstairs, and I was left standing in the darkened kitchen, feeling the weight of a shattered heart pressing down on me. I'd thought that revenge would free me, that exposing her would bring me peace. But now, standing there in the quiet house, all I felt was emptiness. That night, as I lay alone in bed, the enormity of what I'd given up settled over me. I knew that no matter what I'd said to Molly, I could never truly forget her betrayal. Our marriage would never be the same, our lives forever marked by her choices and my decision to let her stay. It was a hollow, bittersweet victory. And in that moment, I realized that in seeking revenge, I'd lost something even more precious than my trust in her. I'd lost myself.